Hello, everyone. It is 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. It's going to be time for us to get started. So I'm just going to clean up some windows here while I get everything started. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video for now due to bandwidth concerns with kids and spouses on computers at the same time. The bandwidth is at a premium these days, and I'm sure a lot of you can sympathize. So this webinar is accessibility ROI. It's risk mitigation as return on investment. Because this is a webinar, the way Zoom works is that you can ask questions if you go to the little control there that says Q&A. There's also a chat control in there as well. You might have to hit the more menu button thing, and that'll give you the ability to open up the chat. If you have any questions along the way, go ahead and dump them in the Q&A part. There is some math and stuff in here, so if I go too fast, if you guys want me to slow down or anything like that, just give me a shout. And with that, I'm gonna dive right in. So the first thing I want to mention, because it is extremely mentionable in this case, is that really I want to say fuck the business case for accessibility. Accessibility is a civil right, and that's all there is to it. So I don't want people to use this as this or anything else as a business case argument, because honestly, we shouldn't have to have business case arguments for why accessibility is important. We should just do it. So I personally regard this presentation as academic in nature only. It was a thought experiment, and I've been evolving some of these thoughts over the years. If you've followed my blog, you may have noticed that you may have noticed that I've discussed this in the past. I did a series on the business case for accessibility a long time ago, and that's mostly because when I did that series of blog posts, it was mostly because of the fact that that people were working on, proposing these sorts of arguments for why it makes good business sense to do accessibility. And again, like I say here, just forget that. The civil rights aspect is really the only thing that should matter. That being said, you still might get dragged into these type of discussions, so let's talk about it. And the first thing I want to talk about are things that I call ROI fantasies. These are things that people often say will be improved by virtue of improving your accessibility. And I'm going to touch on a couple of these. There's probably about 6 of these types of arguments. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these because I just want to highlight some of the weaknesses that you're going to see in those things. So the first one is SEO. And so it seems logical to suggest that improving accessibility is also going to improve SEO. And to be specific, when we talk about SEO and accessibility, we're talking about what's known as on-page factors. On-page factors is these are things that are traits that are on your page that have the ability to increase the search engine rankings for your page and, of course, for your target keywords. Some of these traits are related to accessibility, like a quality page title, good use of headings, alt attributes for images, and quality link text. But here's the thing. It really, in my opinion, remains to be seen how those particular improvements are going to yield an improvement in new business. So that being said, I do want to tell a story. So a long time ago, I did a site fix for a customer called Airflow Research. Airflow Research, if you're not a gearhead, you probably wouldn't recognize the name. They make high performance engine parts. Cylinder heads is what they're mostly well known for. And so that site, after I got done working with it, it went from nearly non-existent in search engine results for their target keywords to number 3, just by virtue of me fixing their site. Now, the improvements I made were almost entirely accessibility related, but the SEO and the sales impact was massive. So first off, the site was in all frames. I removed the frames. The most important content on the site was all in PDFs. I moved that content to HTML. The site had horrible page titles, headings, and link text. I fixed all that. And the SEO improvement was almost immediately. But here's the thing, that site was horrible. So in that case, you could attribute the ROI that they got for accessibility, but it's more of a case of going from a really horrible website to a not so horrible website. We could also say that the converse was also true. In other words, improving the SEO for that site also improved accessibility. So this leads us to unfortunate reality that a lot of most prevalent accessibility problems will have no positive impact on SEO. While link quality and text alternatives may impact SEO, our data shows that by volume, a number of other major accessibility problems exist that, when fixed, will not impact SEO. The information on this slide is based on actual audits done by the Tenon team since 2016. And we've boiled down this data, and we can say that all the top 50 specific test failures are going to fit into 6 meta issues. And you see here link quality and text alternatives are at the top, but there's also insufficient contrast, object labels and label quality, tables and table header structure, and keyword accessibility and focus control. And those last 4 bullets are not going to do anything for SEO. So in other words, yes, there's some things that sort of map to SEO, but a lot of accessibility stuff is not going to do it for you for SEO. Some folks suggest that accessibility is going to make a site work better for alternate devices or low bandwidth users. But again, while this may sound sensible, it's important to examine exactly how that would be the case. And this is definitely an area that's going to warrant some caution, because you first need to know what the business value is for a user on an alternate device or a user who's on a low bandwidth device. And this is pretty difficult to quantify in cases where the site is already horrible on mobile. It's really hard to track down the real numbers for this, because you can say, well, if we make it mobile friendly, we're going to make more money from these folks. And that's true. And the other problem that you have, though, with gathering that data is it could be the case that people go to your site on an alternate device and they bounce because it sucks so bad. So there's definitely, logic behind this. In general, my own opinion on this relationship, though, between mobile friendliness and accessibility kind of works the other way around. Being mobile friendly improves accessibility, but this too also warrants caution. It is entirely possible to make a site that is mobile friendly and still really inaccessible. So at this point, it's important for us to understand a few things about what makes a good business case. The most important part of any good business case argument is that it will be backed by evidence that provides a direct causal relationship between input and output. And the second most important thing is that actual money in the form of net profit is increased as a result of that direct causal relationship. If your business case argument does not satisfy these 2 criteria, then it's a fantasy, no matter how logical or otherwise it may seem. Evidence is always more valuable than conjecture. And unfortunately, a lot of what we have in the business case arguments out there are conjecture. So moving forward, let's take a look at some definitions of things that are going to go into a possible business case. And so the first one I'm going to define is return on investment. And the return on investment is defined as the efficiency of an investment, and meaning the relationship between the money that gets put in versus the amount that comes back. So what constitutes a good return really sort of depends on a ton of factors. The second bullet here, I'm using a marketing example here because when it comes to budget allocation, that's probably who you're up against, okay? And so a company really will probably expect around a 5%, or I'm sorry, 500% ROI on marketing. Now that amount is kind of subject to a number of individual circumstances, like what's known as the cost of goods sold, meaning what it costs you to buy the thing. And so the higher margins on each sale, the lower the ROI needs to be for marketing. And the converse is true as well. If the sales margins are tight, in other words, if your product costs you a lot of money and you're not able to sell it for a really high profit margin, then the marketing really needs to deliver a really steep ROI. So I'll give you an example. A 2-to-1 revenue to marketing cost ratio is not really going to be profitable for most businesses, because the cost to produce or acquire that item is about 50% of the sale price. So for this type of business, if you spend $100 in marketing and you generate only $200 in sales, and it costs $100 just to acquire the product, then you're basically breaking even. So if all you're going to accomplish with marketing is to break even, you kind of may as well not do it. And frankly speaking, that's kind of the way it is with accessibility. Some people might say, well, all I need to do is make my money back, but that's not really awesome from a business perspective. Making your money back doesn't really do terribly well, other than just barely keep you afloat. So now let's talk about some of the costs that we might have. One of those is the cost of acquisition. So in other words, what does it cost me to get a new customer? And so in order to get ROI from that, you really want to focus on reducing the cost. Now, in this case, the ROI from this is the customer lifetime value. You'll see me refer to that as the CLTV. The customer lifetime value multiplied by the number of customers times the difference between the old cost of acquisition and the new cost of acquisition. So basically, when you reduce the amount of money it takes for you to get a new customer, you're going to earn more money from each customer you bring in. So this is one of the things that you can weigh when you're talking about a business case. Another one, of course, is what's known as the rate of acquisition. And of course, very similarly to the previous one, how quickly do I get new customers? So in other words, can I increase the rate at which I get new customers? If you're only getting, a handful a month, let's say 10 a month, can you double that to 20 a month? Then that's a good ROI. So this would be the difference between the new customers acquired over a period of time against what the prior new customers over a similar period of time would have been. You multiply that by the customer lifetime value, then subtract the investment amount, and there you go. Basically, if you can get more customers over the same period of time, then you make your money more quickly, and those gains are going to pile up, which is good. I've been referencing this, and so let's talk a little bit about what customer lifetime value is. It's basically how much money will a converted customer give me during their time as a customer. And this largely depends on the type of business you are. When I've discussed this in the past, I've talked about how I work on cars. I have a couple of hot rods that I'm working on. And so there's a couple of companies I go to for parts, like Summit Racing and companies like that. But the truth of the matter is my lifetime value is limited to the length of time of my project, because I don't constantly do that. So once the project's over, I'm kind of not a customer anymore. So when it comes to your lifetime value, one of the things that you want to do is try to get that customer to spend more money. That's typically through upselling and cross-selling and stuff like that. So in this case, the ROI is going to be the customer lifetime value minus the old customer lifetime value when you increase how much they spend. You multiply that by the number of customers, you subtract the investment, there you go. So basically, if you increase the amount of money each customer spends, then you increase your overall revenue. Awesome. Another one to track very closely is churn. In other words, how frequently do we lose customers? And of course, your goal there is to get the customers to stay with us for a longer period of time. So in this case, the ROI is going to be the lifetime value of customers who would have been lost, but are no longer lost because of whatever the thing was that we did. So again, if you keep your customers around longer and then your gross income is going to increase simply by virtue of the fact that they stick around longer and therefore spend more money over time. So now let's talk about how we can apply those to measure what our ROI would be. And this is really basically, these are the criteria by which we would measure the veracity of someone's ROI claim. Is it going to reduce the cost of acquisition? Does it increase the rate of acquisition? Does it increase the customer lifetime value? Does it increase the rate of customer attrition? So think about this from an SEO perspective, and the ratio between the SEO improvement that you get out of accessibility versus something else. Now I want to throw in another measurement into this mix, which is really simple to understand, which is why I don't have a definition slide for it, is while you can say that cost savings is implicit in some of these, it also warrants its own consideration. And that is, does this thing save us money? And I was driven to this particular concern as a business owner because of COVID. So Tenon's business has survived the pandemic, which is awesome because a lot of businesses haven't. And it really is only due to two things. One is the strength of our consulting business. And the second one is skillful cost cutting. I don't need to tell anyone that COVID has been hard for businesses, but in our case, our gross revenue in 2020 shrank by 20%. In other words, the amount of money we brought in 2020 is 20% lower than it was in 2019. But Tenon remained more profitable, only by a couple of percent, but we are more profitable in 2020 because of cost cutting. We applied a series of cost cutting measures to the infrastructure for our software product, and we stopped spending money on marketing, and we stopped spending money on anything that we possibly could to save money, and that is basically how we survived. So that's a strong business case as well. Now let's take a look at that a little bit more. Let's dive into accessibility. So the harsh reality when it comes to addressing accessibility is the best way to save money is to not do it. Spend zero money on accessibility means you invested no money and therefore need no return. You're done. Well, that's not really likely to end well, as we'll see in a bit. But another possibility really is to do it right the first time. In other words, you would have a team of designers, developers, UX people, managers, content people, and all of these have an excellent grasp of accessibility. And as it turns out, they get it right the first time, and it's all perfect. That's not likely. Yeah. So let's move on. Let's talk about scenario number 2. Scenario number 2 is to fix your stuff. So this table on this slide uses historical data throughout the existence of Tenon. It's based upon real data that we've compiled across every audit that we've ever done. Now, there's a lot of variance in our data because there's different sizes of sites and different things like that. But So what I've done is I've used what's known as a 3-point estimate. If you're not familiar with what 3-point estimation is, it's basically, it's going to use a weighted average to attempt to estimate the final numbers. And in this case, what it does is, if it's done right, and if you apply the standard deviation to these numbers correctly, you should have about a 97% confidence in your numbers. So that's what these numbers are. More important for our purposes in this case, though, is that it gives us the amount of time needed per testable component. I'll run through the table really quickly for those who may not be able to see it. So the average number of components per audit is 28. The average total number of issues we log is 134. That gives us an average issues of 6 per component. Average hours all in for an audit project is 8 per component. If you're not familiar with what a component is, I don't blame you. For us, we consider it to be a testable item, a unique testable item in the system that we're testing. So it could be something like a form, or it could be something more complex like a header or a footer. And the idea here is we want to get unique examples of the UI. So for example, we wouldn't want to test the header and footer across on multiple pages if it's going to be in one template or one type of web component or something like that. We count those one time. And that this is important for estimation purposes more than anything. Now let's talk about the repair phase. So we've done the audit. We then have to we have to get the resources allocated and get them to fix the stuff. So again, using that number from before of 134 issues per audit, now we need to figure out what that's going to cost us. And this kind of depends on what you're using for, how you're using your resources and where your resources come from. In the United States, the average all-in cost rather for salary and benefits and all that sort of stuff for a developer is about $65 an hour. That's the all-in cost, not the salary cost. Average developer cost for a 1099 is about $110. And of course, again, these numbers may vary. If you use offshore resources, it could be significantly cheaper, so on and so forth. So these numbers, you're going to have to actually use your own numbers for this stuff, but I'm using these as our examples. And then the average time per bug is 7 hours. If you've seen me talk about this before, you might have seen a different number here. And that's because we've actually started gathering real data. But either way, the time per bug is pretty difficult to pin down because it's also going to depend a lot of times on things like what type of system it is, what type of bug you have, and frankly speaking, the type of developers you have. How good are they? And so there's lots of estimates out there around how long it takes or how much it costs to fix a bug. But it's really hard to make a blank statement on it. The 7 hours number I have here is Tenon's developers. So we keep track of all the hours and the time it takes to fix the bug for all of our stuff, and across the entire history of things that we've done together, it's an average of 7 hours per issue. So that's the number I got. So here's the all-in time potential for you to fix your site. So the audit, as I mentioned before, take about 230 hours. The repair time take about 938 hours. The total hours for an audit plus you fixing your stuff all in is 1,168 hours. So you can do the math here. The total cost is going to be your total hours times the hourly rate. So we estimate that the cost to do all of this work internally, in other words, you're doing your own auditing and you're doing your own repairing, it's going to be about $76,000. If you're going to use external consultants and external developers, then the cost could be almost twice as high, about $150,000. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that you need to track this spending even if you're using internal resources, because these resources are going to be unavailable to do other work that they would otherwise be doing to advance the overall business goals. So you do have to track this expense, even if it's internal people. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, did Carl just say that it could cost from 76,000 to 150,000 to audit and fix my site? Yes, that is exactly what I said. Now, like I said, your situation could vary, right? You could find a cheaper team of developers. You could find less items. You could test a smaller amount. You might be dealing with a mobile application, and that mobile application might only have 10 screens. So obviously, you're going to have to do ultimately the math is going to be up to you to figure out exactly what it is. But I've at least given you the framework. One thing's for sure, this can actually cost a lot of money. So let's talk about scenario 3. And scenario 3 is really the most painful, because once lawyers are involved, all roads lead to one destination: fix your stuff. That's the only way a lawsuit can go away. The chart on here, literally my favorite, the flow chart on here, literally my favorite flow chart ever. It was made by my friend, Robert Jolly. And it shows, the various paths that you can take, which is that you either get it right the first time, or you get user feedback, do some testing, and make it accessible yourself, and there you go. Or the law firms get involved. So we're going to talk about the law firm scenario. And here's why all roads lead to you fixing your stuff. So number 1, you have no legal defense if your site's not accessible, right? So if somebody sues you and alleges that your site's not accessible, it's not like you can go and fight it and say that their lawsuit has no basis if your site's inaccessible, right? You can't, that's facts are facts. If it's inaccessible, it's inaccessible, and you really can't defend yourself against a lawsuit if you're inaccessible. Now, the second one, though, is if you settle the lawsuit, one of the stipulations in your settlement agreement is that you make your site accessible. So there you go. And the third part of this is, if you fight the lawsuit, there's really 2 ways it can go. You can moot the site, and this is actually something that we try to advocate for when people contact us and they tell us they're getting sued. You can try to moot the site. Mooting the site means getting the case thrown out because it has no basis. That's where mooting, the idea of, you may have heard that something is moot. That's where that term comes from. You fix the site, and then you get the lawsuit to go away. But that still means you fix the site. And the other thing, of course, that could happen is you lose the lawsuit, and then the judge tells you to fix your stuff. So this is why I say, once lawyers are involved, all roads lead to one single destination: fix your stuff. Now, I don't want to oversell it, right? I don't want to sit here and say, well, you're going to get sued, because there is, you do have to think through what is the real likelihood that you're going to get sued. So this on screen is why I used to scoff at people, other people in the accessibility field, who would say, if you don't fix your site, you're going to get sued, because companies were sued so infrequently for a long time. It was very rare for companies to get sued. Yes, it was possible that you'd get sued, but there really wasn't a high probability of you getting sued. Prior to October 2015, your probability was high only if you were among the largest players in a few key industries. Since October 2015, that situation has vastly changed. And long story short on that, that's when the ADA trolls started really getting active, was October 2015. And so all bets are off. On the surface, if you look at the numbers of lawsuits and all that sort of stuff, it would seem as though neither size nor industry really matters. And this is an easy conclusion to jump to when you start to understand that there's about 30 ADA related lawsuits every single day in the United States. And in terms of size, that really no longer matters. While it used to be the case that only companies hovering around $1 billion, billion with a B, $1 billion in revenue would get sued. I've now personally seen companies who only do $1 million in revenue get hit by trolls. Now, while the size threshold seems to have gone out the window, these lawsuits are still limited in terms of what industry you're in. And so these days, the industries that are getting hit the most are restaurants, hotels, and e-retail. When it comes to real estate, restaurants, and hotels, you're generally only going to see an increased risk if you're in certain key court districts. And that would be California, Florida, Pennsylvania, New York, and Florida. So if you're not in there, if you're not a real estate agent dealing in that area, if you're not a restaurant that's dealing in that area, or if you're not a hotel that's dealing in that area, your risk is still pretty low. Those happen to be the most active circuits in the United States. Basically, lawyers in those circuits have found sympathetic judges who are cool with ADA lawsuits, and so that's why you get so much activity there. E-retail is another matter altogether. Basically, if you sell on an e-retail site, and therefore obviously you ship to any of these places, then you are going to have a high probability. So let's take a look at how we can apply some of this stuff. And we're going to measure your probability. So let's assume that e-commerce sites in the United States, you run an e-commerce site in the United States and you have a revenue number of over $1 million. And so that's the population. And then our negative events are going to be ADA lawsuits per day. We're just going to assume 2021 is the time period we're looking at. That's going to be 10,950. And now I picked this number, the number for revenue size, because I just personally haven't seen any company smaller than this get sued. Of course, there could be data I don't have, such as those who agree to settle as a result of a demand letter rather than a lawsuit filed in court. Those records aren't made. Those records aren't made public, of course. So the only numbers I have to go on are the public numbers, and that's the same thing goes for the number of websites. I have 13,000 here because that's the data source that I have suggests that there's about 13,000 sites in the United States that have revenue that big. And like I said, if you have lower revenue than that, it's not likely that you're going to get sued, and not as likely that you're going to get sued as someone with $1 million in revenue. Again, these are often privately held companies, so their revenue numbers aren't public. But this is the data source I have here is a good estimate. So your risk amount in a legal scenario is really easy to understand. It's going to be the price you pay to fix the stuff, right? Because like I said, fixing the stuff is always the end result. And we already know this value because it's the money that we would have spent in scenario number 2. So we have that number. It's the number from scenario number 2, the cost to find and fix the stuff. And then there's a couple of other things that you have to pay, which is you have to pay your lawyer, right? Because you can't just ignore a lawsuit. If you ignore a lawsuit, then what'll happen is you will lose it in absentia. You'll basically get the judge will award for the plaintiff because of the fact that you have not defended yourself. So you have to pay your lawyer to deal with this. And also you're going to end up paying the plaintiff's lawyer. And this is pretty much a universal thing. You can try to reduce the amount that you pay the plaintiff's lawyer. However, if they provide good evidence that that's that those costs are reasonable, then there you go. And if you refuse to pay them, then they can just sue for that amount and they'll probably win. So these are the three things you have to pay for. So let's figure out what our risk amount is. And I have numbers up here. I have the highest and lowest possible values here. It's a 3-column table. The things we're counting are the stuff that it costs you to find and fix the problems, the legal fees for your lawyers, the legal fee for their lawyers, and then the total risk amount is at the bottom. You might be wondering where I got these numbers for legal fees, and I got them from lawyers. And the data is kind of all over the place. I have some, because a lot of these things aren't public knowledge or anything like that. The data here is very small, so I want to be clear about that. But I'll give you a quote, and I'm going to anonymize this quote because this person asked me to. This lawyer says, quote, "A defense lawyer I trust told me you can't even answer a complaint and try to get it thrown out of court without spending around $35,000 for your own lawyer. If you lose, you have to pay the plaintiff's lawyer too, which is typically more than the defense lawyer for various reasons." And that is only fighting to get the case thrown out. If you fight, as in real litigation, there's going to be discovery, there's going to be expert witnesses, there's going to be fees that you have to pay for, various appearances and filings and responses and all this sort of stuff. And so these fees, and this is the quote, could easily be over $100,000 for each side. And the defendant has to pay the plaintiff if the plaintiff wins or as part of the settlement, and so on. So this $130,000 amount that I have in the middle column, that's the minimum number I've personally ever seen. And the right column is the maximum number I've ever seen. So that's $2,200,000. And those numbers are public record. So what I did, of course, I added these things up, and so you can see here the sort of minimum road for the risk amount is $336,000, and the maximum road is $4,550,000. So here's our ROI. Our ROI is our risk amount minus our investment, and then we divide that by the investment times 100,000. So on the low end, our low end is 342% ROI. The high end is 2,900% ROI. That 2,900% ROI is if your risk amount was that massive number. Now I realize these numbers vary significantly, and that's because the legal fees vary so significantly, and also because the data is kind of sparse on what those legal fees are. So like I said on the last slide, my gut says there's probably a better estimate on what it costs an ADA lawsuit, and I'm going to peg that number at $750,000. That $750,000 number is the legal fees and all that other stuff. Legal fees for your side, legal fees for their side, and the amount of money it takes to fix the stuff. So that is going to have a 400% ROI. Now, there's obviously ways to save money on legal fees, not the least of which is just to settle the damn thing. But use extreme caution. I don't ever want to recommend anybody just settle. Just settling is terrible because you still need to make sure that you're not agreeing to extremely harsh settlement terms. In other words, once a lawsuit is filed, you're definitely going to have to spend money to fix stuff. You're definitely going to have to pay your lawyer, and you're definitely going to have to pay the plaintiff's lawyer, even if you settle. But your goal in the defense scenario is to try to reduce the amount of legal fees that you have to spend and reduce the amount of time it takes to get to that point. And this is why you need a really good lawyer to do that stuff for you, to help you along that path. So that's that. Basically, I hope at this point it's become readily apparent that the hands down winner in the ROI argument is also the simplest to understand. Fixing your issues now so you can save money in the long term is the best single business case for accessibility. But also, like I said, the best real argument is because access is a civil right. So that's it. My name is Carl Groves. I have a whole bunch of stuff in here on this slide to contact me. You can follow me on Twitter at Carl Groves. It's Carl with a K. At Tenon API is the official Tenon Twitter account. You should follow that if you want to have a minimum of US politics, because my personal is a ton of US politics. www.tenon.io is our website, and Carl at Tenon.io is my email address.